Most people, when they finally reach the top, stay there. Morgan Gold didn't. He had the title, he had the salary, he had the corner office that was supposed to make everything worth it, and behind all of it, he was quietly falling apart. So at 38 years old, he made a decision that most people would call reckless. He walked away from a chief marketing officer position at a major financial firm, packed up his life in Washington, D.C., and bought 160 acres of raw, untamed land in the middle of Vermont. No farming experience, no blueprint, just a dream and a whole lot of mud waiting for him on the other side. What followed was one of the most honest, heartbreaking, and unexpectedly moving stories on the internet. Animals that became family, losses that broke an entire online community, a man juggling financial pressure, a farm that refused to cooperate, and a camera he kept rolling through all of it. Morgan Gold didn't just build a farm, he built something millions of people couldn't look away from. But the road to get there cost him more than anyone watching from the outside could see. This is the real story of Gold Shaw Farm. Morgan Gold grew up in suburban Connecticut, the kind of kid who was never going to be satisfied sitting still. He was obsessed with drawing comic strips as a child, photocopying them, distributing them to friends, finding any way to tell a story and put it in front of people. That creative drive followed him to art school in Boston, where he assumed a career doing something meaningful was waiting on the other side. It wasn't. By the time he graduated, the only doors open to him were in corporate video production. So he walked through one and told himself it was temporary. It wasn't temporary. It became a decade-long climb through some of the driest industries imaginable. Insurance companies, investment firms, financial services, job after job, city after city. He lived in New York, then Boston, then Washington, D.C., and in every single one of those places, despite being surrounded by millions of people, he felt profoundly lonely. The cities that were supposed to feel like opportunity just felt like noise. By his early 30s, he'd found his way into marketing, a field that at least let him use some of what he'd originally trained for. And he was good at it. Good enough that by the age of 34, he landed the position of chief marketing officer at a large ETF and mutual fund company in Maryland. Most people would have considered that the finish line. Morgan considered it a prison with a better view. He's spoken openly about the fact that despite working harder than he ever had to reach that level, he was depressed and unfulfilled sitting in that chair. The salary was real. The title was real. The emptiness was real too. And it was around this time that something unexpected started pulling at him. He'd begun growing food, just containers of tomatoes on a rooftop in Brooklyn initially, nothing serious. Then he tore up the front yard of his DC row house and planted vegetables. Something about putting his hands in the dirt and watching things grow felt more honest than anything happening inside an office. It was a feeling he couldn't shake, no matter how hard he tried to be sensible about it. The corporate version of Morgan Gold was running out of road, and somewhere out in Vermont, 60 acres were waiting for him. At 38 years old, Morgan Gold did something that stunned almost everyone who knew him. He and his wife, Allison Ebrahimi Gold, walked away from their life in Washington, D.C., and purchased a 160-acre former dairy farm in Peacham, Vermont. Not a charming little hobby farm within driving distance of a city, a serious piece of land deep in Vermont's northeast kingdom, one of the most remote, rugged, and brutally cold corners of the entire northeastern United States. The nearest major anything was hours away. This was not a lifestyle upgrade. This was a complete dismantling of the life they'd spent years constructing. The plan originally had been to save this for retirement, a dream they'd revisit someday when the timing was right and the finances were comfortable. But Morgan couldn't wait that long. His logic was simple and almost disarmingly honest. Why spend the best years of your life grinding toward a dream you keep pushing further into the future? Why not live it now while you're young enough to actually do the work? So they didn't wait. They signed the papers, packed their things, and headed north. What greeted them was not a fairy tale. Vermont winters are not forgiving, especially not in the Northeast Kingdom, where temperatures can drop to levels that make the word cold feel inadequate. The land was raw. The infrastructure was aging, and neither Morgan nor Allison had any real farming experience to speak of. He was a former marketing executive. She was equally city-bred, and neither of them had spent meaningful time around livestock, fields, or the kind of daily physical labor that running a farm actually demands. Morgan himself was quick to admit the farm was more farm startup than actual farm in those early days. The dream was intact. The reality was considerably messier. To stay financially afloat, both of them kept their outside day jobs while simultaneously trying to build the farm from the ground up. Morgan was putting in roughly 50-hour weeks just to fund the operation, leaving whatever energy remained for the land, the animals, and the mountain of work that came with it. It was exhausting before it ever had the chance to be rewarding. But Morgan Gold had never needed the odds to be in his favor. He just needed a camera and something worth filming. The first agricultural decision Morgan Gold made on his new Vermont farm was to raise ducks. Not cattle, not crops, not the kind of sprawling operation you might imagine someone attempting after walking away from a corporate career. Just ducks. It was a practical choice. Duck eggs were a product he could actually sell, and selling something was the only way the farm would ever stop bleeding money. So he got his ducks, set up his operation, and then faced a problem that his marketing background immediately recognized. Nobody knew he existed. His solution was characteristically unconventional. Instead of traditional advertising or local outreach, he picked up a camera and started filming. The idea was straightforward. Document the process of building the farm, show people where their food was coming from, and use YouTube as a marketing tool to move duck eggs. That was the entire plan. Nothing more ambitious than that. The channel launched in late 2016, and in those earliest videos there was no viral formula, no polished production, and certainly no guarantee that anyone beyond a handful of curious strangers would ever watch a single frame of it. What made it work wasn't production value. It was honesty. Morgan filmed the learning curve without softening it. He was a former city-dwelling marketing executive who had never farmed a day in his life, stumbling through the process of becoming something entirely new, and he let the camera see all of it. The confusion, the mistakes, the moments where Vermont pushed back hard and he had to figure out what to do next. That rawness connected with people in a way that polished content never could have. But in those early years, none of that momentum made the day-to-day any easier. Morgan was still logging close to 50-hour weeks at outside work just to keep the farm funded, then coming home to the animals, the land, and the relentless physical demands of building something from scratch. Sleep was a luxury, progress was slow, and the farm was expanding faster than the income could comfortably support. More animals, more infrastructure, more expenses piling up against a YouTube channel that was growing but hadn't yet become the engine it would eventually turn into. He kept filming anyway, and the audience kept growing, and somewhere in that grind, something began to shift. Nobody tells you about the nights, the mornings you walk out to the barn and find something has gone wrong in the dark while you were sleeping. For Morgan Gold, one of those mornings came early in the farm's life, when a predator got into his flock and killed several of his ducks overnight. Just like that, animals he'd raised, cared for, and built a business around, gone. And now he had to figure out what to do with that on camera. His instinct was to hide it. He worried that showing failure would make him look incompetent, that his audience would see the loss and question whether he had any idea what he was doing out there. So he sat with the decision for a while. And then he shared it anyway. What happened next genuinely surprised him. The video documenting that loss became one of the most watched things he'd ever posted. Comments flooded in from people who weren't laughing at him. They were connecting with him, because the failure made it real. It told viewers that leaving the city for a farm wasn't a romantic movie montage. It was hard, unpredictable, and sometimes it hurt. That honesty became the backbone of everything Goldshaw Farm would eventually build its audience on. But the losses weren't only happening in the barn. Around this same period, Morgan opened up about something he'd been managing his entire life, a diagnosis of ADHD. Running a farm is complicated under the best circumstances. Running one with an unquiet mind, while simultaneously managing a growing content operation, outside employment, expanding livestock across ducks, geese, chickens, cattle, pigs, bees, and trees, is another challenge entirely. Morgan has spoken candidly about the systems and adaptations he developed just to keep everything from unraveling. Not as a cautionary tale, but as proof that the condition he'd always carried could be redirected into something productive. The financial pressure during this stretch was relentless. The farm was growing faster than the revenue could cleanly support. Every expansion required capital that hadn't fully arrived yet. Every new animal, every new acre of fencing, every new piece of infrastructure was a bet on a future that wasn't guaranteed. Morgan was building a plane while flying it, and the altitude wasn't always comfortable. What kept him going was the camera, and the community that had quietly started forming around it. At some point, Goldshaw Farm stopped being just a farming channel. It became something closer to a cast of characters that millions of people genuinely cared about, and the animals were the stars. Not in a gimmicky, staged way, in the way that happens when a camera is present long enough, and honestly enough that real personalities start to emerge on screen. Toby Dog arrived on the farm as a livestock guardian dog, a Great Pyrenees whose entire job was to protect the flock from the same predators that had already cost Morgan so dearly. What nobody anticipated was that Toby would become one of the most beloved animals on farming YouTube. Morgan began filming the farm from Toby's perspective, telling stories through the dog's eyes, capturing what life on a Vermont homestead looked like from somewhere closer to the ground. The audience was completely taken. Toby accumulated his own fan base, his own merchandise, and eventually his own children's book published in 2023, available in paperback, hardcover and audiobook, and reviewed by readers as a genuine classic in the making. Then there was Molly Murder Mittens, the barn cat whose name alone tells you everything you need to know about her energy. Molly became a viral phenomenon in her own right. Morgan would mount a tiny camera on her and let viewers follow her as she prowled the farm, and the footage was equal parts hilarious and genuinely riveting. She was fearless, unpredictable, and completely indifferent to the camera in a way that made her impossible not to watch. The internet adored her. The farm's gander, Justin Finch Fletchley, contributed his own chapter of chaos, and Morgan's signature catchphrase, "Release the Quackin'," became the kind of recurring moment that longtime viewers lived for. These weren't manufactured characters. They were just the farm, documented faithfully over years, and the personalities that rose to the surface naturally when you pointed a camera at the same place long enough. The numbers reflected it. A single video titled "Our Freakishly Huge Duck" crossed 1 million views. The overall following climbed past 4.5 million across platforms. On a good month, YouTube revenue alone was bringing in close to $5,000, money that went straight back into the land. Gold Shaw Farm had become something nobody could have predicted when Morgan picked up that camera to sell duck eggs. But the hardest moments were still ahead. For years, Morgan Gold had built his audience on honesty. He'd shown the predator attacks, the financial strain, the exhaustion of building something from nothing. His viewers had come to trust that what they were watching was real, the good days and the bad ones alike. But nothing quite prepared that community for what happened in the fall of 2023. Molly Murder Mittens went missing. For a barn cat, disappearing isn't unheard of. Farms are dangerous places, and the Vermont wilderness that surrounds Peacham doesn't negotiate. But Molly wasn't just any barn cat to the people who'd watched Goldshaw Farm for years. She was a character they'd followed, laughed at, and genuinely loved. Morgan posted updates on TikTok as the days passed with no sign of her. A single video response to a fan asking for news drew over 16,000 likes and hundreds of comments from people who were visibly heartbroken. When it became clear she wasn't coming back, Morgan processed the loss publicly in a podcast episode he titled simply, "The Unthinkable Loss of Molly Murder Mittens." That title said everything about how it felt. It wasn't the only scare the community endured around this time. Toby Dog, the farm's guardian, its icon, the animal whose face had become synonymous with Goldshaw Farm itself, went through a health situation serious enough that Morgan shared updates with followers who had been with him since Toby was a puppy. The outpouring of concern from viewers was immediate and overwhelming. These were people who had watched Toby grow up. Losing him was something they weren't ready to face. What made all of this so affecting wasn't just the grief. It was the fact that Morgan never tried to manage it for the camera. He didn't package it into something tidy or skip past the hard parts to get back to the entertaining content. He sat in it, shared it, and let his community sit in it with him. That vulnerability, the same instinct that made him share his first predator attack years earlier, was what turned followers into something closer to family. The farm had given Morgan an audience. The losses had given that audience a reason to stay. And through all of it, the work never stopped, because on a farm, it never can. Morgan Gold left a corner office at 38 years old with no farming experience, no guarantee of income, and no roadmap for what came next. What he had was a willingness to be honest about all of it. The failures, the grief, the animals he lost, the nights that didn't go according to plan. And it turned out that honesty was worth more than any polished content strategy he could have designed in a boardroom. Goldshaw Farm is still standing, still growing, still documenting the mud and the chaos and the moments that don't fit neatly into a highlight reel. The community that formed around it didn't show up because everything went right. They showed up because Morgan never pretended that it did. In a corner of the internet crowded with curated perfection, he offered something rarer, the real thing. There's a lesson buried somewhere in all of that, about what it costs to build something meaningful and what you have to be willing to lose along the way. Morgan Gold paid that cost in full, and somewhere on 160 acres in Peacham, Vermont, surrounded by ducks and dogs and the kind of life most people only dream about, it looks like it was worth every bit of it.